Well, it's an honor to be here with you tonight. My name is Parker Dooley, and I'll go ahead and ask our panel to come on up while I'm introducing you. I'm a commercial banker with JPMorgan Chase that serves the greater Wichita and South Central Kansas area, and also sit on the board here at the World Trade Council Wichita. And let me echo the remarks of my colleagues earlier. It does feel a little strange to be up here and not being introduced by our fearless leader, Dr. De Silva, but it does feel right that we at the World Trade Council are working to preserve his legacy and his honor by doing what he loves most. And that is continue to educate and equip companies and students to be more active in the international business scene and to drive both innovation and investment here in South Central Kansas to better the lives of those citizens. So we're excited to do that tonight. And one of my key functions as a relationship manager is to kind of be a one-stop shop to deliver the power of JPMorgan Chase to our clients here locally. And I think we've got a great picture of that tonight with a lot of our folks from around the country here who've been brave enough to take on the big topic that is the new administration and some of the changes that we've seen over the first, I guess now 84 days. So maybe in the next 16, this topic might be even different than it is today. So I've asked each of our colleagues to take a look at the Twitter before they came up, just so they can change some of the responses to questions. So before we get started, I'm just going to briefly introduce our team up here. Tonight our moderator is David Page. David serves as a vice chairman for commercial banking activities in South Central Kansas, Oklahoma, and Northwest Arkansas. He began his banking career with First National Bank and Trust Company of Tulsa in 1982, which is a predecessor bank of what is now known as JPMorgan Chase. And he's since served in a variety of roles, including capacities as managing our international banking teams. One of our key panels tonight is Mr. Jack Barber. He's an executive director for international government relations at JPMorgan Chase. And bear with me here, it's a long bio, but I couldn't shake anything down because it's just all too interesting. So Jack joined the government relations team after 14 years in senior positions at the United States Treasury and on Capitol Hill. In his current capacity, he's responsible for working with and analyzing the actions of the United States government, Congress, and governments around the world on issues impacting JPMorgan Chase's global operations. Jack also provides government relations assistance to JPMorgan's lines of business in Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Middle East. Prior to joining JPMorgan Chase, Mr. Bartman served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for International and Legislative Affairs, where he was the Treasury Department's principal liaison to Congress on U.S. international economic agenda. In that role, he served as a policy advisor to the Treasury Secretaries Henry Paulson and John Snow, and was involved in the formulation of a number of international economic policies. On Capitol Hill, Mr. Bartman served as a senior counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services, where he was responsible for advancing the committee's regulatory and policy agenda for financial sector trade and international global competitiveness. He was also legal counsel and legislative counsel to the Honorable Christopher S. Bond, a senior United States senator who represented the state of Missouri. So Jack is going to be our key insight into what's going on in the policy realm, and he has a unique perspective into what's going on in D.C. for us tonight. And then also on our panel, we've got Ronnie Thomas. She's an executive director of global trade with JPMorgan Chase. She works with JPMorgan's corporate clients throughout the U.S. who are engaged in international trade, supply chain finance, and export finance. Ronnie has more than 15 years of international banking experience, including foreign exchange trading, international treasury, and trade. Prior to returning to JPMorgan in 2012, she was a manager of business planning at Texas Instruments, managing a team responsible for a global semiconductor line of business. And last, we've got Eric Molson. He's a senior international product specialist at JPMorgan Chase. His primary responsibilities include assisting U.S. companies to strategize and design global banking and liquidity structures around the world. He also serves as an international cash management subject expert for the bank. Prior to joining JPMorgan, he spent 7 years at Citigroup, where he focused on international treasury products, particularly selling to banks in the U.S. and Canada. And prior to that, he was a member of the Latin American sales team for Deutsche Bank. So we've got a unique panel up here. Folks can have a lively discussion, and how it's going to be designed is David's going to leave some questions to hopefully whet your appetite for question and answer. At the end, we'll open up for about 20 minutes of Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Can you hear me? Okay. Hey. Thank you, Parker. So, we probably like you are looking forward to this tonight. I'm sure most of you have seen what's going on in Washington, but normally when we do an event like this, we would just bring our international banking team in. We thought this was a unique opportunity to call on Jack and talk about things a little closer to Washington. So tonight when we talk about these things, we're going to kind of divide things between policy issues and then actual trade issues. So I'll be asking questions of all three of these individuals. Probably more than a third of them will go to Jack just because the policy is front and center on everybody's mind. We appreciate you guys having us here tonight. We look forward to this particular part of the program and hope that when we're done with this part, there's some lively Q&A, which I'm sure there will be. So thought we might start, and I'm going to turn to Jack on this and say, you know, for most of you who are paying close attention to what's going on in Washington, you recognize that this administration seems to be taking longer than maybe normal or what their predecessors have in terms of getting their team put together and starting down the road of setting policies. So just going to ask if Jack could just tell us a little bit about why that would be and what might be different about this president and this administration that would cause it to be a little bit slower.
So is this
You're on.
working? Okay, good. Thank you, David and Parker, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking to people during a cocktail reception, talking to so many people who are either working directly with some of the markets that we're analyzing and are anticipating trade policies. So hopefully we can touch on some relevant subjects for everybody. But I mean, to your point, and particularly with trade, I think we're all, the president clearly was very critical during the campaign about trade policy as it existed for many years now, and promised change and significant change. In almost 100 days into the administration, I think that there's been some basic principles that have been articulated, largely behind closed doors with meetings of administration executives with members of Congress and others. But as far as really moving forward on agenda, which is we really are still waiting, and there's an awful lot of details to be filled in. But I think you can't underestimate how significant the transition really is, and the number of not only policies that need to be fully developed to move forward, but the number of spots that need to be filled by the new administration. So within every U.S. trade agency, the most important ones being the Office of the United States Trade Representative, Department of Commerce, to a lesser degree the Treasury Department, and even the State Department plays a role in that as well too. These are buildings that are full of incredibly knowledgeable and professional individuals, but they're not in leadership roles, and they know they're not in leadership roles. The leadership roles in all these agencies, and it really is at multiple levels, from the secretary to his deputy, and the position known as undersecretary, which are really the various policy functions within those buildings. And then all of them have politically appointed deputies as well too. But they're all appointed by the president. And as most people have seen, for the most part, they really have appointed the president's cabinet, but have not made much progress with those other layers. And those other layers really are incredibly critical to policy production, much less execution. And at the United States Trade Representative, we have a nominee pending, but he has not even been voted on a committee yet. But I think the campaign, the president's campaign, was so unique compared to the other ones because for the longest time he really was just a skeleton staff. I knew somebody who was very close to the campaign, and he told me in early January of 2016. At a time when Mrs. Clinton probably had a campaign staff of about 200 people, that at that point in time, I think the president had about 12 campaign employees, and at the beginning of that year had not even taken a poll. He had not even spent a nickel on polling, which is such a huge part of modern politics. And for the longest time, he really ran on a skeleton staff, and so did not have this, your traditional presidential campaign with a policy shop that was developing detailed policies that you would pivot on election day, and then along with that is identifying individuals who would hold these spots. And it had been reported a couple times that the president also has a bit of a superstitious streak as well too, and his staff just would not have any luck engaging him on conversations about November 9th. He was completely focused on election day, and it felt that he was not comfortable talking about what would happen after the election. So for those reasons, as opposed to the Bush, when George W. Bush was elected, the Obama campaign as well too in recent memory, I mean, those were really large, almost corporate-like structures that were working on who was going to hold these positions and developing all these key policies that they were going to pivot to and move to on day one. Now, it doesn't, in the end, mean that they won't be developed and won't be effective and implemented, but by traditional standards, they are a little bit behind. But I think recent events, particularly on the international stage, should be a motivating factor to really sort of push through some of the issues that they're dealing with to finalize some of these nominees and get them sent to the Senate.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to spend most of our time on trade and the impact of what this administration is going to embark on. But before we do that, and since we have Jack with us today, I thought it might be important to at least touch on domestic policy. And we all know that during the campaign, then candidate Trump had talked about major changes to major parts of our economy and things that are going to influence where we go, as particularly in the business community. So if you look at issues like healthcare, like taxes, like infrastructure spending and regulation, I guess the question that is on a lot of minds is, how practical now is it for President Trump to attack those issues, and what should we reasonably expect that he could accomplish in his term?
So, the three I think that like analysts at JP Morgan, the economists look at, really are infrastructure, tax, and regulatory reform. Obviously, people are very interested in healthcare. It was a major campaign promise. But also significant legislative challenge as well too, and obviously on the trade front. I think I'm still very reasonably confident, despite how difficult it was on a legislative front with the healthcare bill, that we'll see progress on tax reform. I mean, tax reform is an enormously complicated thing. I think '86 is the year they cite with the last major tax reform. And you also, when you're dealing with Congress, you have to work through a lot of vested interests, and you really have to work through making a lot of difficult decisions. So something like that is never going to be a quick process. I think the legislative rules lend themselves to getting something done on tax reform. So it is a priority. They have a number of difficult decisions to make and to work through. But I'm still confident that will be his first significant legislative achievement, and those have a tendency to generate momentum, and still confidence in some members of Congress, particularly on the Republican side, that are kind of watching to see whether or not some of the criticism sticks, or some of the other issues that are surrounding that sticks, and it's undermined. So. The legislative environment is very difficult, because I do think that there's a number, despite the significant victory, there's a number of Republicans that are watching, the Russia investigation and watching the nonstop press criticism, and wonder whether or not he can weather it, the criticisms on how they're managing conflicts with business, and whether that stuff sticks. And I think in the early days too, on the Democratic side, they had to make a call as to whether or not the intensity amongst their base was such that they had to put themselves in a position where they're going to oppose just about everything, and that seems to be the case. So from a legislative standpoint, it's going to be very difficult to work its way through. But I do think, very confident on tax. And the regulatory environment has changed almost instantaneously by this change of leadership in the regulatory agencies, for the reasons that I said. And that is individuals at the career level are largely not empowered to develop new policies and to continue to pursue additional policies. They've used, you've probably seen in the press, the Congressional Review Act to negate some of the rules that were put out in the last day of the Obama administration. So whether or not there would be legislation to roll back in some of these areas, I think really remains to be seen. But I think the change in leadership alone is significant from a regulatory relief standpoint. And then on the infrastructure, I think it's one of those things that if you have some legislative successes and the economy responds, that you develop the political goodwill and sort of the aura of success that members of Congress start to align themselves with. And so I think some successes are likely to breed further successes. I mean, healthcare is a tough one. It remains to be seen what they might be able to do to sort of bridge some of these divides. I mean, we can talk about that later. But I think on the big three, I think that's up where it really stands right now, and I think there's reasons to be confident.
So, kind of staying with that was shifting in the trade. If you look at candidate Trump and his criticism of our trade agreements, do you see an indication at this point in his administration as to how trade policy is going to be formed and what that might look like?
For putting together statements, really, they've been really behind the scenes, so be privy to hearing about meetings that the Secretary would have had with legislative committees that have jurisdiction over trade, and Mr. Navarro, who was a trade advisor for the President in the White House. I think the principles at a fairly high level are starting to form. I think they're clearly one of the positive things, and the president said this in his statement when he dropped out of the TPP, which many viewed as a negative event, but he committed to continue forward-moving trade policy, meaning that they've committed to continue to negotiate trade agreements, that the U.S. will continue to have a forward-moving one. They've expressed this notion that they prefer a bilateral agreement. And they've also said they would like to get away from some of these very long, drawn-out negotiations, like the TPP is a good example. There's an ongoing agreement with Europe that's a good example. So you would hear trade negotiators, they come back and say, yeah, we're just at the 19th round of the TPP negotiations. So I think Secretary Ross has been very clear. He said we don't want to do that. We want to approach this in a much more business-like manner. We want to identify what our priorities are. We want to sit across the table from our trade partner and say, these are the three things that we want. Please give us your response. We can work something out. We can work something out in a matter of months. It remains to be seen, but they really want to bring a much more focused and dedicated approach to trade agreements. But they've also said, to go back to one of the president's priorities, that they would like to look at policies that they think might be impacting decisions about domestic investment in manufacturing. So they'd like to see more of more of supply chains producing here in the United States. So I think domestic manufacturing is clearly going to be a focus. They've also talked about the same for the defense production pace, that they don't want to see any creep offshore. I think there's some legal protections that prevents that, but they're committed to a strong defense production base. And they also talk a lot about fairness. So as you've seen, there was a recent, the President issued an executive order about a week and a half ago. He instructed the agencies to look at all U.S. trade agreements, look at whether or not there was a trade deficit and what the sources of those were, and if there was some unfair trade policy, discrimination, or a lack of adherence to the rules on behalf of our trade partners. So clearly they've signaled that they're going to seek some sort of redress using U.S. trade laws and call some of the partners, some of the trade partners on past unfair trade practices and follow through on those as well too. So they're still fairly broad and fairly high level, but as far as trade officials, Secretary Ross has been the only one that's been confirmed. I think at the time when they do their notification on a NAFTA renegotiation, I think that will happen. Will be really the first time that they develop on paper anything that really resembles what their priorities would be, and their strategy and how they go about trying to achieve some of those goals. And I think there'll be other goals as well too, but those are the ones that are repeated to members of Congress these days. Yeah.
So, if you look, Jack, in the President's inner circle, that seems to have shifted here lately. And if you look at the more protectionist group of Mike Flynn and Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro, they've either fallen out of grace or have been removed completely, and kind of a more pro-global group seem to step in and be his closer advisors like Rex Tillerson and General Mattis, Secretary Ross, that you've mentioned several times, and even Jared Kushner. So what do you make of that shift, and is there anything to read from that?
Well, I think the China meeting at the end of last week was a good example, and the President had a follow-up conversation with President Xi this week as well too, in recognizing the fact that if you have security concerns in this instance with North Korea, that the economic issues they're just not going to be handled in isolation. So to have a relationship with a country like China, that you have difficult economic issues, but you also want them to be a partner at a strategic level, then you have to be a little less, I think, strident on some of these economic issues. And I think that's something that the President has come to take on recently. But I think when you get down to it, some of the rhetoric about tariffs and some of the rhetoric about walking away from agreements has subsided somewhat. But I think the core concept of fairness has not, and I do think that Secretary Ross is going to be the President's principal trade advisor and really is going to lead the administration's efforts in developing trade policy, pursuing the strategy, and following up on it. But every statement that I've seen him make, he's been very, he's repeated, he's really stuck to the concept that we need to ensure that our trade partners are playing by the rules. There has to be a greater element of fairness in this, and that we still have a commitment to making sure that not only we can open markets, continue to open markets, but that there's no reason why we can't have a more robust domestic manufacturing sector and healthier two-way trade relationships. So it all pieces together. But I don't think that he's distanced himself too much from that core fairness principle, which was really at the root of a lot of what he said on the campaign trail.
So I'm going to split this into two different parts, and so the first part, Jack, can be directed at you, and then the second part, both Eric and Ronnie, like your feedback on. First, if NAFTA is renegotiated, what might it look like, and what are some of the key considerations?
So I think, I do think a NAFTA renegotiation is going to happen. And I think it'll be the administration's first major trade initiative. Everybody will remember or recall the passage of the TPA legislation, but part of what TPA does is it binds the executive branch to consult with Congress and talk about priorities and commit to addressing some of the congressional priorities when it comes to a trade agreement. So they're actually going through that consultant exercise right now. The law also requires them to issue a formal notification to Congress, and then there's 90 days from that day that they can begin negotiations. So the next stage is really to issue that notification. I think it's going to happen. They've been much less clear about what their overall ambitions are. I think anybody who would look at an agreement, a recent agreement like TPP, versus an agreement like NAFTA. I mean, NAFTA, I think, was ratified in 1994. There's a number of issues about intellectual property that have been developed in TPP that are absent in NAFTA. Data movement, which is very important to a lot of companies, data storage, and so there's a lot of 21st century trade issues, market access barriers that could really go into enhancing it. Now that's not what the president was getting at on the campaign trail. I do think that they are trying to come up with some ways that will, again, enhance the incentive for U.S. companies to invest in domestic manufacturing. So whether that is some sort of content rules or rules of origin really remains to be seen. But I do think that would be their primary objective. And beyond that, I think they'll seize on some chances to modernize. But I think for the president to declare victory, I think there would need to be something in there that they would argue would enhance domestic manufacturing. But at the same time, too, I think they don't want to be involved in one of these long negotiations. I think there's risks in that as well, too. I don't think this is insulting the president in any way, but he certainly doesn't come across as a very patient person. So I think he'll want to see results and see results fairly quickly. And so I don't think he'd be satisfied with a 2.5 year NAFTA negotiation. So all that, I think, goes to the point of having a much more limited scope and a limited set of objectives when they actually pursue a negotiation. Yeah. But all that's really has yet to be laid out.
So, Ronnie, I'll pitch this to you first, and then Eric, maybe some comments from you. But I think there's a lot of concern, at least amongst our client base, related to the unknown around renegotiation of trade agreements, particularly NAFTA, as a lot of companies in this part of the world are reliant both for imports and exports on that trade corridor. So are you seeing anything that would indicate that American companies may change their behaviors related to a possible renegotiation of NAFTA?
Not yet.
Are you on?
Am I on?
Okay.
Not yet. We were talking about this the other day. And I haven't really seen too much of a shift within my client base. What I have seen just over the course of my career, though, is just the sophistication of the manufacturing that is in Mexico. I would say, back in the late 90s when I started in trade, a lot of my clients were more in the retail and apparel space, and they were doing a lot of kind of cut and sew work in Mexico. But so many more of our clients now, it's much more into, aviation. I know quite a bit of components are coming from Mexico and going into product here, as well as in the automotive space. So that's the shift that I've seen, but right now I feel like everyone, at least the clients that I've been speaking to are more in a wait-and-see pattern and not really doing much to change what they're doing.
Eric, anything to add to that?
I would agree with that in that it's sort of a wait-and-see approach. If maybe part and parcel to NAFTA. You also have an evaluation of the peso. Over the last few years, it has really affected businesses. So maybe a trend that we're seeing is a lot more of a focus on risk management of currency. If the peso is the functional currency, then there's certainly a lot more attention being paid to that now, perhaps, than in the past. And I think in addition to NAFTA, you have some other hot topic or hot button items in the country. Next year, July, is a presidential election. So just as we've gone through with our new president, how does the new administration or the same administration get along with the Trump administration? So as much as the formalized NAFTA agreement, I think there's some other dynamics there that are interesting in that play as well. But I think, again, sort of wait and see for now to see how things play out.
Can everybody hear?
No.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is act like a rock star and put that thing right up to your mouth. So I think it'll pick it up a little bit better. So next, let's talk about the Export-Import Bank. I think maybe most of you are familiar with that organization, but I thought it might be important to just talk about what it is, what is its purpose. And so, Ronnie, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Exim Bank, the formal name of it is the Export-Import Bank of the U.S. It's an agency within of the U.S. government, and its sole mission is to, even though import is in its name, its sole mission is to create jobs through exports. And the way in which they do that is by working with commercial banks and offering guarantees to credit facilities that we wouldn't ordinarily look to book for our clients because they're exporting into different areas of the world and we don't want to lend perhaps against certain foreign receivables or the inventory associated with foreign sales. So, it's called an export credit agency and there are multiple ECAs throughout the world. You mentioned China earlier. In comparison to the U.S. Exim Bank, China has 3 ECAs in their country. And we have about 400 employees at Exim, whereas the Chinese in total have about 10,000 employees. So what Exim Bank brings to the table for our U.S. manufacturers is a way to level the playing field so that when you go and you bid on a big project, in a different country, you can bring financing to the table, or before you ship, you can get some pre-export financing that you may not ordinarily be able to find. So yesterday, we got a pretty positive piece of news from the president that he is right now they don't have a whole quorum for the board, and they have to have 3 members on the board to make a quorum. And if you don't have a quorum, some of the larger transactions can't go through. When I say larger, the ones that are 10 billion and up. So there's a backlog right now of 30 billion in transactions that are waiting to be looked at and to ultimately be approved. So yesterday, President Trump came out in support of Exim Bank and said that he would nominate 2 more people to the board. So after that occurs, then it has to be ratified by the Senate. But it certainly was a positive for Exim Bank, and certainly, in looking at, his policies in terms of exports and growing manufacturing and jobs, it's probably right up his alley there.
So basically a reinforcement for the rest of his agenda, right? Shifting back for a minute, Eric, to Mexico, you had mentioned the upcoming presidential election. I think there's a mayoral election for Mexico City. Do you see the current administration, President Trump's team, having a favorite in that race or a preference as to who might sit in the seat?
I think the short answer is I don't know. It's certainly what he is thinking, but I think the Mexico City is a mayoral race coming up, which certainly is important, and then the presidential race, I believe, is next July. So it will be interesting to see if the incumbent party remains in power, or if there's a shift to more the left or the right. As mentioned, I think the current president, has a few challenges in the country around security and a slow economy. So it'll be interesting to see within the country sort of the people's view of, hey, we need to change something. So you need to make banks with the United States and continue to do business, or see if they continue to have somewhat of your protectionist view. So yeah, I'm not sure if he has a favorite yet, but I think in the next probably 6 to 18 months, that'll become another topic of conversation.
So maybe whoever will agree to pay for the wall.
So, or half of that.
Okay, well, Jack, back to you. When part of the rhetoric we heard, particularly through the election process, was border adjustment tax. And a couple of things. What would that mean, and do you think there's congressional support for that?
Just a quick word on Mexico too, for those who are working in the Mexican market and have a concern about U.S. and Mexico relations in general, because when President Peña Nieto canceled his trip to the U.S., it certainly made a lot of news and appeared fairly ominous as far as the future of U.S. and Mexico relations. But I've been around, just so people know, I've been around enough of officials from Mexico, and they've said that they feel as though they've been treated very well by this administration. They have an open door. They spent a lot of time together really talking about the relationship and some of the non-trade things there. So I think as far as U.S. and Mexico relations at a government-to-government level, I think they're a lot better than what is predicted in the press, which I think could help with these negotiations. As far as the tariffs, the president on the campaign trail had threatened the imposition of tariffs in a number of different contexts. I think he talked about manufacturing that leaves the United States, Mexico, China to a degree. I think that has really receded. I think part of it is that anybody that the U.S. is in a trade relationship with or members of the WTO, fellow members of the WTO, there really are legal limits on the U.S. imposing tariffs outside of extraordinary legal situations. There's some statutory measures that allow temporary increases in duties, but it really has receded, and I think the president has made clear that we're going to explore other avenues to pursue fairness and pursue new agreements before we would resort to tariffs. The one area where the tariff question still remains is as you mentioned, David, the border adjustment tax, which is an element of the House tax reform plan developed by Speaker Ryan. And I think there really are two elements on it. I don't know precisely how it works, but component parts, really imports are taxed, but similar component parts that are manufactured in the United States are not taxed or are deductible. But in the appeal of it is, from Ryan's standpoint, is that when you crunch your numbers to try to come up with the revenue that you would need to pursue a fairly comprehensive tax reform plan, the score is massive. It generates a lot of money, and it would really allow them to move forward on their corporate tax simplification plan. So I think that's the attraction there. And for others, it does have the incentive where it could potentially make domestic manufacturing more attractive. The other problem is obviously that it's an immediate tax with an input of 20% on imports, and so these are costs that consumers are going to feel, and they're going to feel right away, whether it's cell phones, whether it's certain kinds of groceries. But really, a lot of basic household items, I think, would be impacted by that. Now, the economists would argue that we would all see an appreciation of the dollar that would increase their purchasing power, and it all washes out at the end. But I don't think that that theory is one that's going to be very appealing to members of Congress. And so, you know, at last check, I think the border adjustment tax is still part of the House plan. But I think the support in the House is slipping, and I don't think it has a necessary level of support in the Senate. So it could be revived, but I just, as of today, it doesn't appear as it's going to make it into any tax reform plan. But book's not closed yet.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at the time. I'm going to reduce this to one more question. It's kind of a two-part question. We'll open it up for Q&A so we give all of you a chance to ask a few questions. And this is related to Brexit. For those of you who may have heard that term a lot, not know exactly what it is, although I'm sure most of you do. It's the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, which that country basically had a vote last summer and surprisingly decided to do that. So the question, first part, Jack, is to you. So what are the next steps for Prime Minister May now that Article 50 is going to vote?
So I think she's really made the big decision. The big decision was whether or not, initially I think the UK thought that they could, in a way, almost cherry pick, continue to stay potentially in the single market for this product or this industry. They made the decision that we're just going to have a clean break, and then we will go back to the negotiating table and negotiate a comprehensive FTA with Europe. There's a lot of other messy issues that they need to settle first, so the actual exit involves property, financial obligations and commitment and settling all those sorts of things. So there's money involved, and those are going to be very, very difficult, and some immigration status issues as well too. But they hope to, in about 9 months, pivot, and it would essentially be a UK-EU comprehensive free trade negotiation, which really would cover just about every sector and dictate market access, tariff, customs, and all those trade-related questions. So they've got, I mean, that could technically go on beyond the 2 years, but I think their goal is to start in about 9 months and hopefully be done within the 2 years. And the next major thing is really the EU has to lay out what their negotiating objectives are. And that will come out on the 29th, where there's a meeting of all the remaining 27 member states. We have to agree on that. And then the negotiations can begin.
So, Eric, I'm going to turn to you on the second part of this. So what are some of the key considerations for U.S. companies that are today doing business in the UK and in the European Union?
Yeah, this is very interesting because it's obviously unprecedented. I think waiting to see in the next 2 years how this plays out and the effect of maybe your suppliers or other customers, see what happens to them, I think would be very interesting. For one consideration, you might hear about citizenship or passporting. So you've got a British citizen that's able to work in the EU or vice versa, as it is now. So depending on how these negotiations go, there may be issues around that, where there's a limitation of folks from the EU working in London, let's say, as a major financial hub, or vice versa. So there could be certainly a very large, perhaps, shift in employees, or where a company may look to locate its business or its employees. I think another issue, agreements that companies have with suppliers, again, depending on how these free trade agreements are renegotiated. Any contracts that you have in place with your counterparties and suppliers certainly could be something that you would certainly want to review. And I think lastly, banking relationships. You know, we all know that London is a major financial hub. Many banks have a presence there. They're able to open up numerous foreign currency accounts in London. So that could be affected as well. So perhaps, you know, only UK denominated entities or UK legal entities, for example, are allowed to open accounts in London. And a Dutch entity maybe needs to be open in the Netherlands and items like that. So again, there could be some major impact. I think it's a bit of a wait and see at this point. I think, any of you that are doing business there, certainly, don't wait, make sure you understand where are my accounts, and, what currencies might I be holding? Is it euro or pound sterling? That certainly could be affected, with some volatility in the certainly in the coming years. Just understand where that business is, and understand that if there's a shift, and you have to relook at your suppliers and your banking relationships, that you've done that ahead of time.
Good. Well, I think at this point, I've got other questions, but I think we're going to run out of time, and we want to allow you some time to ask questions. Since Parker is our most athletic member of this team, I'm going to ask that he take Ronnie's microphone. If you have a question, could you just hold up your hand so that everybody can hear it? We'd like you to use the microphone. So, are there any questions? Over here.
Well, just today, President Trump just went back on his comments about China being a currency manipulator. When people like to try to determine what the next policy is going to be, what indicators do you look at? From what we've seen in the past, we can never tell what the hell he's talking about. We can never trust what he's saying, so what indicators would you trust?
You just have to read the statements, read the statements of his officials, and I don't think he's, like I said, in the area of trade, I don't think that he's drifted too far from the core principles. In the case of China, the U.S. Treasury Department puts out a report twice a year. It's on their website, and I can't remember the formal name, but it's the report on international economics. A significant feature of it, though, is looking at exchange rate management and other actions of governments in the previous 6 months. And there's a long track record of them criticizing China's intervention. Past administrations have chosen not to elevate it for a variety of different reasons. But market conditions have changed, and in a way, I think it's almost to his credit to recognize that fact and step away from it, because the conditions have changed. But like I said, there's a lot of policies to develop. This is a person that comes out of the real estate world, which is international. I think his business is international in nature, but it's not trade related. You haven't had to deal with security issues, so if somebody's making a significant transition into areas that he's never been around before. So there's going to be an adjustment, and there's going to be a learning curve, and a lot of it is just putting behind political rhetoric. But I think we listen and ask questions, same as I think everybody does in their information gathering process.
Question in the back.
Hi there. It's late, I'm tired, I hope I'm coherent. Chase JP Morgan, you're a powerhouse. Many of us are customers of you. And our new president, whatever the case may be, there's a plan versus action. There's promises versus reality. So with that as the backdrop to what you've said so far, is that shapes our policy and our strategy. In other words, your policy and your strategy as Chase, JP Morgan. So as customers, many of us who are, how does that affect us with you? In other words, your go-forward plan based upon what is going on right now. What is your strategy? What is your policy? And how is that going to affect us from this point forward?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Yeah. So, do we have any softballs out there? You know, I would say, if you know anything about our organization, you have to look at our leader, which is Jamie Dimon. That guy is solid as a rock, and he does not bend with the political winds. He doesn't bend with anything other than his own plans. I would tell you, and you know, I'm having to forecast a little bit here, but my read of that would be related to what we do. We look at our own plans, but we also pay attention to what's going on around us and what can affect those plans. I think the biggest issue, maybe front and center for us, is what impacts our clients first, and then what impacts us directly. What impacts us directly in this piece is probably more around the regulatory environment. And I think right now there's a lot of people on the business community side that are having a voice in Washington to say what is good regulation, what is maybe okay regulation, and what is regulation that might move the needle a fraction of an inch but is very costly. And I think there's a real effort to get some clarity around that and not to do away with regulation, but to start looking at it from the perspective of how does it impact these different industries, ours being one of them. So I think that's the area where we're most directly impacted as an organization. But quite frankly, the greater impact to us is what happens to our broader client base in this process. You know, I think the challenge is in this first 100 days, they're still forming the team and they're still developing policy. So all of us are a little bit in a wait and see mode. I think we're hopeful that as time goes on and as the team really gets in place and kind of in our first question of the night, talking about really having all of the large organizations that are going to be working on policy, that we'll start to see some momentum there. I think we've had a pretty clear indication from President Trump as to the things he'd like to attack. We still have a long ways to go to see how well he's going to be able to execute on that.
I would just add too, if you have not, I would always recommend reading his shareholder letter.
Yeah.
Came out last week, I believe, and so as David said, Jamie's very forthright, and there's about 45 pages of his thoughts in the shareholder letter, and it's always a very interesting and informative read, and talks about what he's seeing in the world and the direction for the company.
Thank you. Mr. Trump actually campaigned on bluster and he has to govern on reality. So now we see him walking back from bluster to reality. The question is that his voters and his supporters who bought on his bluster, they're going to be disappointed when they find out that governance has to be grounded in reality and not in bluster. So what do you think is going to happen in the political arena in the future, say 1 year down the road, when he's not going to deliver on his bluster? We already started to see that. You know, he campaigned on calling China, currency manipulator. China, I know, stealing $400 billion from us every year, and today he's saying that no, that is not the case. So how is he going to sell that to his core supporters?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. And it's a very interesting question. And I think a lot of people recognize that some of the campaign rhetoric was excessive and non-traditional, and really did not know what to expect from a governance standpoint, because he's a true political outsider. And I think that's something that they're going to have to deal with. And if he decides that he wants to run for re-election, that is something that he's going to have to address. It's a great question, and I think a lot of people are going to be looking to see how that plays out. And, me among them.
You said it. Thank you very much.
Ashton Holst Machine Shop? Yeah, I am not so interested in your predictions, because who knows what would happen. That would be an earthquake tomorrow right now over California. But I would like to remember Adama da Silva. A good thing to say about him is he knew trade when trade was good, and he sold me his book. A guy, a person who loved his original country, Sri Lanka, who used to be called Ceylon. But still, that's what he did. And he sold me this book for $25. And when I asked the students around, they said, why? We only paid $20. That's what I believe about Adama da Silva.
We might have time for maybe one more question if there is one.
I just have a really quick one, and I can project. What outside of your personal contacts would be the best news source to get some
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
to
end.
get some real news?
Real news?
Yeah, like you look to daily to get.
As opposed to fake news?
I say that. But what do you look to every day to get your updates?
You know, I hope there's no press in the room, okay? But I'm going to tell you something that I heard from Bryant Gumbel a few years ago. We had him as a keynote speaker at an event in Tulsa, actually, and I got to spend an afternoon with him, and we were talking about just that issue, and I said, so what would you tell a young person today in terms of how they form their opinions and where they get their information? And I loved his response. He said, I would tell them to go seek out sources that are counter to their point of view. I think today, in his view, most of us gravitate to some sort of news source that reinforces the way we think and misses the other side of the conversation. If you're asking for a news source that's truly practicing journalism, I can't give you a good answer myself. I can tell you some sources I use, but they all, quite frankly, have an editorial piece to them that swings one way or another. I don't know, others may have a different response for that.
Well, I agree to look for sources that you may or may not agree with, but I like The Economist. I think it has shorter articles, and it comes out on a weekly basis. So it's something that, because I think it's hard to, if you have a busy life, it's hard to, just keep up with everything all the time. But I like The Economist because it's very global, and it, it kind of goes into a lot of different details. So that's what I like.
I read the Wall Street Journal every day but Sunday, because they don't publish on Sunday. I think the FT is an excellent paper as well too. And then Politico covers Washington, I think, more thoroughly than anybody else. A lot of people take exceptions with some of their coverage, but they're